Hi, everyone. Ari Witten here. Welcome back to the Energy Blueprint podcast. I am here today with a very special guest, someone whose research I've been reading for a very long time, and I'm honored and privileged to have him on the show finally. His name is Dr. Valter Longo, and he's one of the world's top longevity scientists. He's the director of the Longevity Institute at the University of Southern California and of the program on longevity and cancer at IFOM, which is the Molecular Oncology FIRC Institute in Milan, Italy. So welcome, Dr. Longo. Such an honor to have you on.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah. So you are also the author of this book, which I have thoroughly enjoyed. It's the best nutrition book I've read in a very long time. And it's also unique in the sense that this is not just a book emerging kind of capitalizing on some of the latest trends in the nutrition world and diet world. And it's not just some gimmicky pseudoscience of how to lose weight fast. This is based on decades of solid research, and you are an actual scientist in the lab conducting a lot of this research yourself. So it's quite remarkable in how different of a path you've been on relative to a lot of other popular diet trends going on right now.
Yeah, so obviously my mission has been from the beginning not about scientific discoveries, but how to use the science to make people live longer, healthier. And it takes a long time, you know, and I was a student of Roy Walford, and he was a pioneer of something called calorie restriction. And but that was too early. It didn't work very well. It had incredible effects on diseases, but wasn't really extending lifespan. And so I think in the book we talk about how we took that understanding, that knowledge, and brought it to something that actually works, and that's probably not going to change in the near future.
So you're obviously known for your research on longevity and the fasting mimicking diet. Can you give us some of the most important discoveries or discovery in the science of aging that you're unveiling in this new book?
Yeah, so the book is divided into two parts, right? One is the everyday diet. So what do you eat every day? And the other is the fasting mimicking diet, which is something periodic, and people do it between once a year, twice a year, and 12 times a year. That's the idea. And this is we'll talk about it's a 5-day diet that mimics fasting. And so I think that our discoveries back in the early 90s started with the genes that regulate aging. And that was really important. Now people say, well, what does that have to do with diet? But it was key, right? It's key in understanding, for example, the identification of the protein signaling pathway, which is Taurus cis kinase, and the sugar signaling pathway, which is the PKA pathway. These were very, very important in developing this fasting mimicking diet, and also in developing everyday diets that are likely or highly likely to extend the lifespan. And not just lifespan, but the healthy lifespan.
So the fasting mimicking diet. Well, I guess I'm not sure where to go here. I guess we have two avenues we could go down. We could talk about healthy foods, not so healthy foods as it relates to longevity, or I think let's dig into the fasting mimicking diet specifically. So what is that all about? Why is fasting important and beneficial? And how does the fasting mimicking diet relate to fasting?
Yeah, so fasting is a little bit like calorie restriction, right? It's been around for a long time, but doctors have always been very scared of it. And there are some clinics that are very good that specialize in fasting for long periods. But it wasn't ever very clear whether it was beneficial or detrimental. So there's people, I would say most people still think it's detrimental, most doctors, and some think is beneficial. And I think so. We took for the past many years, we really look at what does fasting do, water only fasting, and what are the problems with this. And so this fasting mimicking diet is a result of that, and it's basically trying to get to the right length, to the right type, for the right use, right? And trying to take something that could be good and bad and make it mostly good or only good. So the fasting mimicking diet, it basically pushes the body into getting rid of damaged components, cellular components, and damaged cells, and then turns on stem cells, and also turns on intracellular mechanisms and rebuilds, right? So the rebuilding, interestingly enough, doesn't occur until you start eating again, right? So it's really, this is why it's so important to have mechanisms, because you could be fooled by thinking that you can do something long term and it's going to work even better than short term. But the trick is actually do it for short periods and then combine with the refeeding. That's destruction of damaged components, rebuilding of good components, and then get into a maintenance mode, and that's what works, right? So again, warning, we hear all the time talking about intermittent fasting, and I really dislike this word because it doesn't mean anything. It's been applied to 2 hours of fasting, to 10 hours, to 20 hours, to 20 days, right? So it's like saying eating, intermittent eating. What does that mean? So I think it's very important to start understanding and having something that is clearly defined, and then people can use it knowing what the clinical results have been, because otherwise we're going to end up with most things back in some good, some bad.
Yeah. And there's so much in what you just said. I want to dig. I mean, I feel like I could ask you 20 questions right now, but one thing you commented on there is this idea of the length of fasting and what is the optimal length. And this is something that I personally have not been able to find a clear answer to in the research. And I've actually been wanting to ask you this for a really long time, because there are some proponents of like 7 and 10 day fasts, sometimes even longer fasts. I've seen other people who are proponents of, kind of this, what they would call intermittent fasting, what's come to be associated with that term, which is this really more time restricted feeding, like confining all of your food intake within one meal a day, or within a 6 hour, 8 hour chunk of the day, and having, an 18 hour or 20 hour fasting window each day. So I would say on one end of the spectrum, you have that sort of time restricted feeding of between just 12 to, let's say, 20 hours a day of fasting, versus this long-term fasting of 7 or 10 day fasting. Now, what's your take on that, as far as, is there an optimal length of time that one should fast? And are there unique benefits of the longer term fast that you don't get from shorter term, let's say, single day fast?
Yeah, so I'll give you maybe a little bit longer answer. So in the book, I talk about, planes and the shuttle. And I basically say, look, when we build planes, we don't look for opinions, all right? We don't say, oh, there is some people that think that the wing should be like this, and some people that, so you have Boeing, they've been doing it for a long time. That's all they do. You have Airbus, and they know exactly how to do it. And, it's evolving, right? The plane is not always the same, but very similar for a long time. So it started back in the Leonardo da Vinci years, and now with planes that almost never come down, right? And everything in the plane is studied to the close to perfection. So when it comes to diet and the body, you have to do the same. It's much more complicated than a plane, by the way. And so you have food that is made of all these nutrients, and you have the body that is extremely complicated. So you have to go with data and only data. This is why I say, I talk about the 5 pillars, and I say you have to go with epidemiological data, clinical data, basic research, and centenarians and studies of complex system, planes and
and if I could just interrupt you very briefly on that point, I love that you do that you have all of these layers of evidence and you're focused on putting together the big body of evidence, because unfortunately there's so much cherry picking going on where somebody's drawing only from this study or that study on one particular layer of evidence and not looking at the big picture.
And I think that's where the confusion, so I think the best job, if I had to say, like, what do you have to read about this book? I would say, okay, you can even not read any of it. Just read when I talk about the 5 pillars, and don't even read my book, then go out and just judge the opinion based on, okay, did you consider epidemiological studies? Did you consider clinical studies? And so you filter out 99.9 of
learn to be scientifically literate.
Right. And then after you filter out 99.9, then you say, okay, now let's start talking about real data combined. So when you do that, then you see that, all of it is good and all of it is bad. So what I mean, like time restricted feeding, for example, no doubt that if you do 12 hours or 13 hours of fasting per day, is very good, right? Very little data in any of these different disciplines suggesting otherwise. As you start going lower, then you start having metabolic problems, sleep problems. So if you fast for 7 hours, you eat for 16, 17 hours, you start seeing problems. You start seeing people overweight, not being able to sleep, metabolic syndrome, so insulin resistance, et cetera, et cetera. And that a lot of people, I think, appreciate. Very few people, even experts, appreciate that if you go over 13 hours of fasting, you start seeing problems too, right? So you start seeing gallstone formation, major increase, by the way. And that's a major surgery that you'll have to receive if you have a gallstone, and your gallbladder is going to be removed. Also, a lot of people don't realize that most people that do, say, 16 hours time restricted feeding skip breakfast, right? Because they have dinner. Everybody loves dinner, and then you say, okay, I'm just going to skip breakfast. Well, turns out that study after study after study, epidemiological, shows increased mortality, increased cardiovascular disease from skipping breakfast. Now, you could argue, say, oh, but yeah, that's because the people that skip breakfast. Okay, fine. Maybe there is another reason, but the point is, and not worth risking it, right? If you don't have, not only you don't have a positive result, you have a negative one. Do you really want to do that? I mean, you're trying to extend your lifespan when the data, one of the pillars, shows decreased lifespan, right?
Yeah.
So it is not a good idea. So go with 12, 13 hours. That's what I talk about in the book, and that's good to go. Now, the longer fasting, there's really almost no data on 2-3 weeks of fasting, right? And I can tell you that if you ask 100 doctors, 99 will tell you got to do that in a clinic. So that really cuts out, the great majority of people because, it is so dangerous that it's not dangerous, meaning that a lot of people can do it and be no problem. So, a lot of people can do it at home. It's not dangerous in the sense that everybody be killed by it or everybody will have big problems, but a percentage of people have big problems, right? And it could be, if you went to 2-3 weeks, it could be as high as 20-30%. 1 out of 3 might have some big problem. So you can't do that. And there is really very little data, almost no data on this. Some of these big clinics are working on it, but there is no data. So, then you have to go with what's available out there. And so 5 days, we have a clinical trial. We now have tested over 20,000 people with the prolonged fasting mimicking diet. So, we're starting to build the data and you go with that. Now, everybody else, there's some data from Michelle Harvey and others on the 5-2 diet, and some of that is very positive, very nice. And Michelle and Krista Varadi also in Chicago. So you have to, look at those and evaluate. Some of the concerns, I think, with the 5-2, which refers to 5 days. The way Michelle Harvey has it is 2 days in a row of a very low calorie, about 500 calories per day. So that's, I think, a better version than when you split it apart, because when you do one day, then you wait to do another day. And the reason for that is that the body, there's a circadian clock, right? So the body likes to have something very repeatable. So it's like sleep, right? If you sleep for 5 days and then you don't sleep for 2, it doesn't work very well, right? And I think it's the same with food, but they have very nice results. And so that's a very interesting path. Now, the 5 days, some of the very important things, it takes about 2 days to get into a ketogenic mode, right? So it takes about 2 days for the body to switch from using food from the outside completely to using your abdominal fat, as we've shown for fuel. And then it takes also a couple of days to start breaking down components, white blood cells, muscle cells, et cetera, et cetera. And that sounds like a bad thing, but it's a good thing, because when you refeed, you rebuild this, right? So if you don't break it down, you're never going to be able to recycle, so to replace damage with good.
And right now you're talking about the process of autophagy, of breaking down damaged cell parts and sort of rebuilding new healthy ones.
Well, I'm talking about both autophagy and stem cell based regeneration. So the body does it in 2 ways. Autophagy, which was already known, as we have discovered, it breaks down also cells and turns on stem cells. So, for example, we published a paper last year on the pancreas, and we can do heavy damage to the pancreas. destroy all the insulin producing beta cells, or at least make them non-functional, and then do the fasting mimicking diet cycles. And you see that there's an embryonic-like program that gets turned on, right? So the pancreas looks a lot like the pancreas when you were first born or in the early stages of life, because it's now ready to rebuild or rebuilding the at least the damaged components. So it's a really powerful program to rebuild inside of the cell, but also at the organ level.
Okay, so just to wrap up that last question that I had, it's if you would say the optimal length of fasting to sort of maximize benefits while minimizing potential side effects, what do you think that would be?
Well, I think that in Europe, when I first published the book, I made the mistake of basically telling people, well, you could do the prolonged fasting mimicking diet, which is what we tested clinically, or you can find an expert and they do it for you. And B was a disaster. Why? Because a lot of the experts were not really experts, and even those that were experts, they cannot teach somebody how to make their own medicine at home, right? So what we tested clinically has 66 components in it, and I don't make a penny out of it. So I want to make sure that people understand that I assigned all my shares of a company that makes the fasting mimicking diet to charity, and also don't take salary or anything from it. But
that's awesome.
But I just realized that if we make it so that people have to go home and cook it up, yeah, 70%, 80%, maybe even 90% sometime, maybe even 95 will be fine one time. But in the long run, you're going to hurt a lot of people. And we had doctors calling us. We had lawyers call us. And a lot of people were, and patients, of course, right? A lot of people were angry because they say, oh, I thought you said this. And so they were going home, making it up. And then, a lot of them were fine. A lot of them were hurt by it. And so we say, let's stop. Just do it with the kit that has been tested clinically. And I think out of close to 25,000 people now, we had very, very little problems and reports from patients or doctors of problems. So I really think for the safety and the efficacy, it should be done with this prolonged fasting mimicking diet that was tested clinically. Now,
okay.
In the book, I pretty much describe what the fasting is. Diet, so people can actually go to an expert. I mean, I didn't want to hide it, and so that people think, oh, see, he's trying to sell his product, and so it's there. People can pretty much follow it and do it. I strongly discourage people from doing that because, again, we've seen the problems that making medicines at home can cause. Okay,
so. We have this fasting mimicking diet, which we're going to dig into the details of that. But I just want to clarify one more point on this subject. So the fasting mimicking diet is a low-calorie diet with specific foods and herbal teas and various ingredients that are there that you found to be particularly effective in mimicking the benefits of fasting or stimulating a lot of the same benefits. And maybe there isn't an answer to this, but I'm just really curious. What if like one day of fasting or 2 days would you say that something like 1 day of fasting or 2 days of fasting is maybe equivalent in terms of benefits to the 5 days of the fast mimicking diet? Or can you make comparisons like that at all?
Well, 1 day every how often?
Let's say once a month.
Yeah, no, 1 day out once a month is obviously not going to be comparable because now you don't even get, after 1 day, your body still mostly works on food that you've taken in the day before, right? Mm-hmm. So there's glycogen reserves and it takes up to 30 hours for the food to be digested. So 1 day is definitely not going to do any of the things that I said before, enter a ketogenic mode and really. So, for example, after 4 or 5 days, the brain switches from using almost exclusively sugar for energy to using 50-50 ketone bodies and sugar, right? So that's where you want to get to have the full effect.
Okay.
And that's why the 5 days is there 5 days. We don't gonna want to go longer because also of compliance and safety, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when if you go longer, then you start really getting into a territory of a clinic being needed, right? But shorter, we really don't think it will have, certainly not once a month. Now you could do it more often, let's say, like the 5-2 diet twice a week. We just think that some people can handle that kind of like a chronic calorie restriction, but for a lot of people, every 3 days. I mean, we think that the fasting mimicking diet on average would be done once every 4 months, right?
Mm-hmm.
And even that, maybe eventually we hope 50% of people will consider, right? And that once every 4 months. Now imagine once every 3 days, somebody tells you to do something. Yeah, I mean, some people can do it and benefit tremendously, but to a lot of people, it's going to be a big. I know for me, if you tell me just to not eat dinner once a week, I would be suffering starting the day before that I know dinner, and I say tomorrow is the no dinner day.
Yeah.
So,
Gotcha.
but
So one more, I guess, little layer to this, which is, it sounds like what you're saying is there would be unique benefits to, let's say, 3 days or 4 days or 5 days of fasting that you wouldn't necessarily get with 24 hours of fasting.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So with that in mind, one thing I guess that we could dig into from here is what you brought up a couple times now, the idea of ketones being in circulation and getting into ketosis. There's a lot of popularity of the ketogenic diet that is going around right now. A lot of people talking about nutritional ketosis from very, very low carb, very high fat diets, typically animal food based diets with lots of, various animal foods and saturated fats from animals and so on. And there's a lot of people also making the claim that being in nutritional ketosis sort of gives you a lot of the same benefits as fasting does. So what's your take on that? Are there unique benefits from the ketones themselves? Like, let's say you take a ketone supplement and you have lots of ketones floating around in your body. Is that in any way mimicking the benefits of fasting?
It's of course, if you take in ketones, it's gonna potentially activate, or most likely activate, enzymes that are processing ketones and using ketones. But that's a big mistake, right? It's a big mistake because the body is now set, if you're eating normally, is set on a normal metabolism, right? And so all of a sudden now it gets a signal for a different metabolism being required without the program being there. And it's a little bit like I talk about a hybrid car, that is designed to either use electric power or gasoline, like some of these cars out there. And but all of a sudden you impose both at the same time, right? Without programming the car. I mean, of course you can program the car, but we're not programmed to use them both. We're either starving or we're not, right? And so if you're not starving and you get both signal, well, it could be that if you did that to the car for a while, it works better. And you say, look, since I've been using my car, I just tweaked something and now I'm using the electricity and the gasoline at the same time. It's working better. It's going faster. And I'm getting more miles to the gallon or whatever. Eventually what's going to happen is going to break down, right? I mean, not for sure, but almost for sure. Why? You're pushing something that was not designed for that car. And so the same for the body. Now, so that's a bad idea, clearly. No doubt, right?
So just to clarify for anybody who didn't quite follow, you're saying there's kind of mixed signals going on. In the one sense, our bodies are programmed to get into ketosis as part of the protocol for calorie restriction or fasting when we don't have enough food available to us. But now these nutritional ketogenic diets are creating sort of mixed signaling where you're eating enough calories to kind of go on living on a regular basis, and you can do that indefinitely, but you're also having this other signal, this sort of fasting related starving signal of ketones being in circulation. And it's kind of, you're saying it's kind of mixed signals to our biochemistry.
Yeah, you're confusing the system, including the brain now. All of a sudden, it has to decide, what do I do? And it's trying to do both, right? And so now, who knows what's going to happen to neurotransmitters, serotonin, dopamine, dopaminergic neurons, et cetera, et cetera. So it could be that eventually you're going to have, let's say, a neurological problem, right? And I would bet some money on that, right? I mean, if you think about it, like for a car, I think most of us would bet some money that if you had the electricity and the gasoline, trying to, somebody tweak the car to do both at the same time, I think most of us would bet some money that eventually it's going to break down.
Yeah.
So yeah. The other thing is though the ketogenic diet, right? That's a little bit different because the ketogenic diet, you can see in the past that that there is an evolved need to be able to respond to, let's say, a high protein, high fat, high animal fat diet, extremely low carbohydrate. So that's a different argument there. And the argument is more based on the pillars again. So what if you ate all the time and say, I'm just going to have a very low carb diet and high protein and high animal fat and etc. Well, if you look at the pillars, you're going to have very little support for this, right? So if you look, for example, epidemiological data, a lot of the data, particularly if it's animal-based, shows increased mortality from almost all causes, right? If you look at our paper, high animal protein is associated with several-fold increase in cancer, 75% increase in mortality from all causes. If you look at the animal data, if you feed the mouse high-fat, animal fat, high-protein diet, it dies very much earlier, not later, earlier, right? If you look at centenarians, not a single one of the record longevity areas of the world, Okinawa, Loma Linda, Sardinia, Calabria, Costa Rica, Icaria in Greece, none of them have a high fat, high protein. If you look at some of the population, like Inuit, somebody pointed out, I mean, I'm not an expert on Inuit, but my understanding is they have some diet similar to that. They have a 10 years shorter lifespan than the Canadians, right? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, you can, as you were saying earlier, you can go find one pillar or half a pillar, say, oh, but this guy has shown the cholesterol is lower by, absolutely. There's a lot of there's healthy ways to lower cholesterol. They don't, they have 5 pillars instead of 1, right? So that's the point. Now,
and let me just, for anybody who hasn't read your book and doesn't know the 5 pillars, these 5 pillars are basically layers of evidence from like epidemiological data, from population level data to randomized controlled experiments to the physiological mechanisms. Basically what he's saying is, do all of these layers of evidence add up in a way that they all point in a particular direction, or are certain people just cherry picking from one pillar of the data and only drawing from there, and then the other data are pointing in other directions or don't even exist?
Yeah, and I always like to talk about the courtroom, right? And I say, can you imagine if somebody was up for, it was on a murder trial, and the lawyer shows up and say, I think he's guilty. He was around the murder scene. So in the courtroom, we're very careful with these 5, I don't know about 5 pillars, but there's certainly 4 or 5 pillars that you use before you decide whether somebody's guilty of a major crime or not, right? Yeah. And, you have the DNA evidence, you have the motive, you have to have, so many things go into that. And then the jury looks at all that and say, okay, I think you're guilty or not, right? But it would be laughable if somebody just showed up with one, say, yeah, you were there, you were around the area, so it must be you. So that's what we're doing, I think, with some of these diets.
Yeah. One more kind of layer to this that I want to also ask a question on, which is, I do see some vegan authors kind of cherry picking the data and leaving out some research where, there are certain studies that I've seen come out in recent years where they haven't found strong links between, let's say, animal food consumption, red meat consumption, or animal saturated fat consumption and heart disease or cancer or all-cause mortality. There have been some studies where they haven't found strong links with those things. Certainly processed animal foods are kind of universally recognized by everyone as bad. But there still seems to be this debate where I've seen people in paleo circles and keto circles say, see, this study found that butter and red meat consumption didn't harm health in any way. So what's your kind of take on the fact that certain studies like that exist?
Yeah, well, first of all, as somebody that has done epidemiological studies, multiple with some of the top people in the world that do this, I can tell you that epidemiological studies are very tricky, right? So you take large populations and then you say he eats more butter, he eats less of this. It's extremely difficult because, and you can pretty much come up with any answer you want if you manipulate or look at the population in different ways, right? So, let's say, look at a population that has high meat but happens to exercise a lot, right? Versus a population that has low meat but exercise very little. So I would say that, being vegan, first of all, is not necessarily good. Why is it not good? And this is why I talk about pescatarian diet, not a vegan diet in the book. Because a lot of people that become vegan, they become too restricted, right? So it's very difficult, especially if you jump from a regular diet to a vegan diet. All of a sudden, you're going from all this nourishment, all these proteins, all these minerals and vitamins, etc., to something much, much more restricted. And that's where, I think problematic, and you see it, you can become protein deficient, you can become B12 deficient, et cetera, et cetera. So, we don't know. I mean, it could be, the point is not to say, couldn't there be another diet that has animal and that is grass-fed and this and that, and it's as good as the pescatarian diet that I described? Absolutely, there could be, but there's one pillar evidence for it. So do you really want to get into that when clearly, most of the pillars are suggesting that you're going to shorten your life by doing that? And also, don't forget, one thing is the perfect implementation of something. One thing is what people get out of it, right? So if you go out there and somebody say, oh yeah, but I go and get the grass-fed meat and I eat this much of it, I eat low levels, and then I get the eggs also that are from the garden next door. I mean, yeah, you can do that. The question is, what is everybody else going to do when you tell them this, right? So with the pescatarian diet, you pretty much guarantee that they're going to have an optimized life, right? Because, it's supported by so many things. With this diet, whatever interpretation they come up with could, maybe none of them will be beneficial, but maybe in some cases it'd be beneficial, but some other interpretation of it will turn out to shorten someone's lifespan. So it's not worth it to, now, if you can't, like with smokers, if you smoke and you can't quit, I mean, that's the way it is. I mean, nobody's saying that you're going to be forced to do it, but certainly it's good to know that smoking kills you.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're saying basically the overall body of evidence, all the 5 pillars point in the direction that at least large amounts of consumption of meat and animal foods more broadly is correlated, and animal protein and animal saturated fat are correlated with decreased longevity, higher risk of mortality from various diseases.
And not just large amounts, but like also normal amounts. If you look at Southern Europe, the consumption, of meat used to be very low, and a lot of animal products, cheese, and et cetera, et cetera. And then in the last 40 years, you see a big increase. And if you look at breast cancer, prostate cancer, a lot of cancers are used to be much lower than the U.S. and now they've caught up, right? So now could be other reasons. Absolutely, there could be a reason, but the suspicion based on our data on protein, animal protein, and cancer, et cetera, and many other data is that in fact, even going to moderate to middle level, let's say, of of cheese and meat and chicken, and so every day having a different version of this or a couple, it could be seen as normal, and that's what's associated with the modern 40% chance of having cancer in your lifetime, and however whatever percentage close to it about cardiovascular disease and the epidemic of diabetes. I mean, if you just look at the last 40 years, we really becoming, long-lived but sick population. And so, yes, if you want to be sick and be on 7 or 8 drugs when you get to 60, then continue with this, high animal cheeses and the fats and the protein. But if you want to, get to 100, have a high chance of getting to 100 healthy, then I think the vegan pescatarian diet seems to be by far a much better choice.
Beautiful. So let's dig into macronutrients a little bit. Carbs, fats, proteins. I know you talk quite a bit about protein in the book, and you have some very specific recommendations and that are also age specific. So I would like to dig into that, but first, I'm actually curious if you have any general thoughts on carbs to fats. Is the carb to fat ratio of the diet playing a critical role in longevity or disease prevention, or is all the hype around carbs and fats really overblown in your opinion?
Well, what's overblown and the big mistake is the demonization of macronutrients, right? Carbs are good, carbs are bad, fats are good, fats are bad. And none of it is good and none of it is bad, or all of them are good and bad. So I talk about in the book 60, 30, 10, 60% carbs, 30% fats, and 10% protein. And so if you look at carbs, I mean, I had, on Amazon, there's people that I say, oh, but you carbs, I've had a low carb diet and I'm doing so well. People confuse sugars, starches, and carbohydrates, right? And I try to be very clear in the book, but it's not easy to get people to understand. So what should be high or very as high as possible is the legumes, and they contain carbs, the carrots, the peas, et cetera, et cetera. That's where you should get your carbs from. Those are great carbs. There's really almost no data suggesting that those carbs are bad, even in excess. 2 should be low levels of starches, right? And so pasta, the bread, the rice. So I talk about, make it 50 grams in your dish, 50 grams of pasta, and put 300 grams of legumes and 100 grams of vegetable. That's a great dish, right? Almost no data against it, a lot of data in favor. And then you can have a little better bread here and there during the day, 30, 40 grams. So very limited amounts. And then the sugars now should be, let's say, less than 10 grams a day, right? Of added sugar. So now if you do that, that is, people, in a lot of people's, for a lot of people, this would be a low carb diet. I mean, it's a diet that has low levels of the bad carbohydrates that they hear so much about that being detrimental. And sure, and I absolutely agree, but it should be a high carbohydrate diet of the kind that I just described. So the fats, same thing, right? Olive oil, I mean, there's some data out there saying it causes inflammation and this and that. But the overwhelming majority of the data on extra virgin olive oil is very positive, including large clinical trials randomized, right? So, of course, you got to get calories from somewhere. You're never going to have perfection, I mean, that's another thing. It is no diet that is enjoyable that people say, oh, this is a very good diet, I'll keep it for the rest of my life. It is going to be perfect. That you cannot find some study saying, oh, causes this, it causes that, like, with now cereals, everything is under attack, right? But so the fats should be nuts, walnuts, hazelnut, almonds, salmon, some fish, fatty fish, and olive oil. Those are great sources of fat. And now the bad sources of fats are the animal fats, the butter, et cetera, and even the vegetable fats, the margarine, et cetera, are probably not such a good idea, and now even coconut oil, at least the American Heart Association argues that may be bad for you. I don't know, but certainly, there's a case for it. And then, 10% protein, and again, legumes and fish are by far the best way to do it. And a fish a couple times a week is also very good, to prevent malnourishment. And so it's not easy to get enough. So many people that are vegan, you ask them, well, can you tell me in the last 3 days when you had your proteins? And they'll say, well, I had whatever, rice with garbanzo beans. And then I ask them, how many garbanzo beans, chickpeas did you have in it? Oh, I don't know, maybe like 30 grams. And that's 3 grams of protein, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, so that's what people do. And you know, so demonization, and then you go into diets that are missing important components. And that's why in the book I describe all three. And I think this is a good way to go, 60-30-10.
Yeah. And now protein requirements change a little bit as you age. I know there's some data that suggests that if you're above a certain age, you should change your protein requirements, protein intake a bit. What can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, probably not just protein. So we found that after 65, using the enhanced CDC database here in the US, the people that had a very low protein diet were not doing so good anymore. They were doing great before, but not so good after 65. So probably because IGF-1, which is controlled by protein, this insulin-like growth factor 1, which we think is so central together with other growth factors in aging, is lowered by age. And by the time you get to 70, 80 years of age, is low enough that it doesn't matter. And that's what we've shown also in the paper. If you have a high protein diet, you know, it might actually help you instead of, I mean, not a high protein, but let's say a moderate protein diet. So have sufficient protein. So increase your protein level to also prevent lean body mass loss, and you know, and of course exercise. And this might not just be about protein. It might also be about the variety of the diet. So I talk about, you know, start introducing maybe some eggs, some goat yogurt or milk or cheese in your diet when you get to 70, 75, and maybe you know, some additional fats. Why? Probably because the body struggles to process all the complex food and needs more to do the same job than it used to do with less. And for example, we've shown in a paper that mice that are young can deal very well with 4% protein, extremely low levels of proteins. But mice that are old, if you put them on 4% protein, they struggle, they rapidly lose weight, right? So then we suspect that the same is true for humans, that you just have to be, nourishment becomes more important or much more important after the age of 70 in particular.
Now, is that based on just one study, or are there a number of studies that are all pointing in the direction that maybe you want to raise protein intake as you get above 65 or 70?
There are a number of studies. So there are studies, for example, showing there are you know, the number of studies from geriatrician looking at protein intake. These are like short-term study. You know, how much protein to maintain a good muscle mass. So there's a number of studies showing that about 1 gram per kilogram is ideal to maintain you know, muscle mass when you're over the age of 65, 70. But then there is also data. There are data on let's say body weight, suggesting that being a little bit overweight after age 65 is actually helpful and not detrimental. So this is indicating that after 65, 70, having a little bit of backup, whether it's fat or muscle or you know, other nutrients, it's probably beneficial to have a little bit of reserve. So this is why in the book I talk about compromise. You don't want to, let's say, go from low protein to high protein. But if you want to go, let's say 0.8 is what I advise, so 0.35 or so proteins per pound of body weight. So 100 pound, 35, 40 grams a day of proteins. So you might want to go, say, 20% higher, 20, 25% higher after the age of 70, and just look at your lean body mass. And if you're going down, as it happens for many people, then you might want to increase a little bit further, and of course increase training, muscle training, and exercise a little bit.
Yeah, I was also going to ask about that. If you modify protein intake according to if like physical activity levels at all, like somebody who is, let's say, very lean, has low body fat percentage, but has a lot of muscle mass and does a lot of physical activity, do you recommend higher protein for those people, or pretty much kind of you have that 10% protein recommendation for everyone across the board?
Well, in the book, I talk about the data on muscle synthesis, and it looks like several studies are showing that if you have 30 grams of protein together with the training, that maximizes the building of the muscle. So you don't need more. Now you could say you could do it twice a day, theoretically, right? So you now have 60 grams, but that seems to be maximizing. Now, somebody, what I usually recommend is for somebody it's very important to have a lot of muscle. Then I say, do lower it to the level that where you start noticing that you no longer can maintain that, because most people that train, they know exactly, what their muscle is like, and so they can keep track of it. So, and by the way, we're doing a trial now in University of Verona on this, on muscle strength and fasting mimicking diet. But yeah, we're not doing it on an everyday diet. But I think that I would stick with the 30 grams rule and per meal together with the training, and then if you start losing muscle mass, then go higher until you get back to whatever it is that you're happy with.
Great. So let's dig into specifics on the fasting mimicking diet. So we've talked quite a bit now about general recommendations for eating for longevity. What is the fasting mimicking diet all about? And how does it differ from other diets that are out there in terms of specifics?
Well, I mean, again, the fasting mimicking diet that comes from 25 years of work and the genetics of aging and the discoveries made by my lab about regeneration of multiple organs and systems and on and on and on. So, yeah, the fasting mimicking diet is really trying to be a substitute for many drugs, or certainly a complement and when possible, a substitute. So the idea is that, you go to the doctor, and you have high cholesterol, high blood pressure, and et cetera, and high fasting glucose. So you're pre-diabetic, in the stage where you have a high risk for cardiovascular disease, you may have systemic inflammation. And so now they start giving you drugs. And we envision that soon enough that you're going to have these clinically tested fasting mimicking diets to do that. And so how does it differ from other diet? I mean, what other diet? I mean, it's there is nothing like that out there. This is really a new way of thinking, in the sense that, from not just from me, but the field of aging and it's been saying for a long time, but certainly very loudly for the last 20 years, that we can't treat diseases, or we can try to prevent cancer. It's pointless, First of all, if you cure cancer completely, people don't know that you will extend lifespan by a little over 3 years. That's it, right? And so the average lifespan. And and also you could do something that prevents cancer, that increases cardiovascular disease, right? So you just now, it's a wash, right? It doesn't really help you. So this is why
just to clarify that, if you cure cancer completely, you only extend average lifespan by 3 years. Is that because cancer is generally an end of life disease?
No, because you die of something else.
Okay.
So on average, people, if you cure cancer completely, on average people, within 3 years, they would die of something else. You die of heart disease, you die of diabetes, you die of something else, right?
So you're saying that, like, the underlying health issues are still there, whether they manifest as cancer or something else, or?
The underlying problem, aging, right? Aging is still there, and aging is breaking down, it's compromising every single one of your systems. So if you cure cancer completely, of course, you'll have benefits, but you just live a little bit longer, and that's it. So the point of this fasting mimicking diet is really not addressing a diet at all. It's addressing, how do I regulate the aging process without affecting, in a way that people can be compliant, and without destroying somebody's life, because you tell them, oh, you got to do something crazy, and they'll never do it, and without causing side effects. And this was the problem of this, chronic calorie restriction, that refers to lowering calories all the time by 30% below normal level. And so, people have been knowing about this for 100 years, but it's never really done any good. Why? Because nobody wants to do it, first of all, and then it causes as many problems as it causes solutions. And that's just why you now have to come up with something much better. And I think, this fasting mimicking diet is certainly one of the ways I think that we can start addressing these issues.
Now, kind of a big picture question, but why are humans biologically programmed this way? Why are we programmed to respond to periods of fasting with all of these effects, increased autophagy and cleaning up our cells of damaged parts, and increasing stem cell proliferation and regenerating the immune system, and increasing brain neuron growth? And why does this happen? Why is our biology programmed to respond with all of these beneficial effects from depriving ourselves of food? I mean, and we're used to talking about benefits of fasting, but if you think about it in those terms, it is kind of an odd thing, right? So why are we programmed this way?
Well, it's probably the main answer is probably pretty straightforward, which is when you're starving, and this is why I use the analogy of a wood burning train. And so if you have a wood burning train, old ones, right, 100 years ago, and you know that you're not going to make it to the next station, then you can go and start looking around the train for seats that are broken, walls that are all made of wood, right? So you start taking those and you burn those, right? You wouldn't get the good ones first. You get the broken one. Then eventually you get the good ones. Why you do that? Well, you're not going to make it to the next station, right? You don't have a choice. You have to do this. And then you get to the station, you refuel, but at the same time, you rebuild the train, right? So you're going to put new chairs in. So I think that's what the body does, right? So if you're starving, and you can imagine throughout history, you'll have months and months of starvation, right? Maybe in the winter, maybe, a dry season or whatever. And so now you have to make it through 1 month, 15 days, 2 months of no food at all, or very little food. And so what do? You start shrinking, and you start taking part of your liver, your lungs, your immune system, your muscle, right? Everything shrinks. Of course, the fat goes first, but the fat is of course the fuel. And so then of course you're gonna be very thin, and hopefully you get enough food, and then you rebuild. Now imagine if you went from, let's say, somebody who's 100 kilograms, so 200 pounds, and they went from 200 pounds to 100 pounds, right? Now this will happen in about 3 months, right? Wow. And so now you go to 100 pounds, and eventually you find all the food again, and you're just gonna start rebuilding, and you're gonna go back to 200 pounds. So it's 100 pounds of building. How is that gonna happen? Well, mostly is not even cellular, is new cells, stem cells, right?
Wow.
This is why we're seeing this embryonic developmental program, because you're really building organs. All right, now you can go from a liver that is now 1/3 of the size to 3 times bigger in a matter of potentially of a month. Nobody's ever done this experiment, but we suspect that that's how quickly you could rebuild 2/3 of a liver. Now maybe I'm exaggerating, I don't know, but maybe not. So certainly, but certainly it will go back to its normal size or its original size within a period which could go from 1 to 6 months, let's say, right? Mm-hmm. So, and of course, the liver regenerates on its own normally, but does very slowly, and so do most other systems, and some systems don't regenerate at all. So now you really have an opportunity to just get rid of a lot of junk and bring in, and also we suspect that the body knows how to pick not just any stem cell, but pick a good stem cell, right? So pick a healthy stem cell to then give rise to this new to rebuilding. So for example, when we do transplants, bone marrow transplants, you take a fasted bone marrow and you put it into a naive mice that doesn't have an immune system, and you see after 1 month and 4 months is a superior rebuilding, and you're starting from scratch. You have no immune system. The recipient mouse has no immune system. You put it in, and even the stem cells from a regular bone marrow will rebuild the immune system. but the ones that from the fasted will rebuild much quicker and to a a higher level. So
Wow.
so it's just amazing. It's probably going to pick very few stem cells that are highly functional, and those are the chosen ones to give rise to a new immune system.
Wow. So all these effects that you just mentioned translate into benefits for certain diseases. What specific diseases have you guys studied and found the most benefits on?
Well, the first one was cancer, and so now there are a number of clinical trials on cancer and combination with chemotherapy. So the idea is that it would enhance the efficacy of chemo and reduce the side effects. There are several trials already published. They're small and they are positive. There is another one that is about to be published, also positive. But the big ones haven't been finished yet. So we'll see. And then multiple sclerosis and autoimmunities. We published one paper that had a clinical component in a mouse and 60 people human clinical trial. That also had the ketogenic diet that did not perform as well as the periodic fasting. A continuous ketogenic diet did not perform as well as the periodic fasting diet. And so we've done diabetes. This is mostly mice, but we've done pre-diabetes in humans. Diabetes in mice, both type 1 and type 2, and it was very effective. We have done some studies on cognition and age-dependent brain function in mice, and that worked very well. So, I mean, the idea is that it's going to be beneficial in a lot of places where there's damage, and the damage the damaged cells and damaged organs have to be helped by functional ones. Can be helped by functional ones. So this is why I think it's got such a broad potential effect. Now, in humans, we're just getting started. But certainly in the clinical trial that we finished, as I mentioned earlier, we showed 100-patient clinical trial randomized. We saw in the people that had high cholesterol, high blood pressure, high triglyceride, high fasting glucose, high inflammation, etc. We saw a high risk factor for cancer. We saw a significant decrease, in some cases a major decrease, right? So it's really looking like it's doing what we hope it would do, which is to rejuvenate the system.
Yeah. And I know we're about to run out of time here, but hopefully just a couple more minutes. In relatively healthy people, do you suspect that incorporating fasting mimicking diets every so often will translate into increased longevity and slowing down the aging process itself?
Yes, I think so. I mean, we've shown this in mice, so we started middle age. They're perfectly fine mice. They have a very good diet. They don't have a longevity diet, but they have the standard diet, which is considered relatively healthy. And that extends the lifespan, reduces cancer by about half. This is not an induced cancer. These are just spontaneous cancer that happen on a standard diet. It reduces inflammatory diseases in mice. So the answer is yes. Now, it will have as much of an effect on healthy people that exercise as it does and have a very good everyday diet as it does on people that don't exercise and have a terrible diet. Absolutely not. I think it's going to have a much bigger effect on people that have bad habits. Bad habits, of course, it's probably about 80% of Americans. So I think for the great majority of people, a tremendous effect. And for everybody else, probably doing it a couple of times a year is sufficient.
Gotcha. So the plan is probably somewhere along the lines of eat in accordance with the principles that you've outlined on a daily basis, and then incorporate the fasting mimicking diet somewhere between once a month to once every 6 months?
Yes. And I should point out one thing, because some people complained, the wheat, the gluten, et cetera, et cetera. So obviously, there are foods, and I didn't talk too much. I talked about it, but not too much about it in the book. And I realized I should have expanded that. So obviously, different people have different intolerances and autoimmunities, et cetera, et cetera. And for those people, or even those that suspect that they have the problem, obviously, I'm not telling people to follow the diet that I have in there, which has wheat and et cetera. So an important point is to figure out what your specific needs are, and then adapt the diet to your needs with the help of your doctor.
Yeah. On that point, let me just ask you directly, since you're including wheat and gluten in this diet, which, as you just pointed out, are very commonly demonized by a lot of health authors and so on that are popular now, some might say that this is very surprising, sort of, don't you know that wheat and gluten are very bad? Because I read it from someone else. But you're saying in the overall body of evidence, you don't believe wheat and gluten consumption is in any way at odds with longevity or disease prevention.
No, absolutely not. I mean, the longest people in the world, most of them eat lots of products from wheat. And now, again, like I said, for lactose intolerance, you could be tolerant, you could be intolerant. If you're intolerant and you drink milk, you're going to have a problem, and that problem is probably going to shorten your life. So if you're gluten intolerant, now keep in mind that in the book, I talk about the 50 grams, and of course there are now pastas and bread, etc. They have low gluten or very low gluten, right? So I didn't, specify which kind. So I certainly didn't say, oh, go pick the one that have high gluten content. So a lot of the problems that we've seen when the gluten content in these ingredients went way up, and people started having these big dishes of it, right? So,
right.
And in the book, I'm absolutely against that. It stopped having these dishes of rice and pasta that you see everywhere, right? And go down to 50 grams. And so that, I think, will solve the problem for the great majority of people that have gluten intolerances, because we didn't used to see this in the past. This is why I also talk about eat at the table of your grandparents, because now by having all these new components, say gluten at very high levels, all of a sudden the immune system doesn't understand why you have all this gluten, and starts attacking it because it's worried that it's some invading organism.
Yeah. Do you think, on that note, just to digress really quick, do you think GMOs and glyphosate has any role in kind of why so many people are intolerant to wheat and experience negative effects from it, or believe they do at least?
I mean, nobody knows. My suspicion is it's got a lot to do with antibiotics. It's got a lot to do with drugs that people are taking. It's got a lot to do with eating disorders, and so once you now start an inflammatory process in the intestine due to antibiotics or whatever, and now all of a sudden you combine it with an antigen, a lot of gluten or whatever else, now you have a recipe for disaster. And so now the immune system is very active, and it's very alert, and it's going to look for anything that may look like an antigen, so an invading bacteria or virus, and it's going to attack it. So that's my suspicion. The evidence for it, we don't have it, but certainly this is starting to build up. That the microbiota, of course, is very, very important. Having a good one to prevent immunity problems, etc., and not just immunity, many other things. So I suspect that when you destroy a lot of it by antibiotics, and we're using them like they're candy, and that you're gonna set up the system for a mismatch with the food, or certainly attacking the food, some of the food you take in.
Yeah. So my final question, if you have one more minute, do you have to run right this second, or?
Okay, you can ask it.
Okay. My final question is, can you take us through a typical day of your eating habits? And feel free to do this very quickly without details, since I know we're very short on time now.
Yeah, so in the morning, I have usually a green tea and black tea together. Why? Because I don't like green tea, and the black tea covers it, but green tea is healthier. And one lemon, I use a whole lemon in that tea. And then I have like a toast, cinnamon raisin toast with blueberry on it. Then lunch, if I'm starting to gain weight, I skip lunch. I just have some almond milk or something like that. But normally, like right now, I'm normal weight, so I have lunch, and I might have a salad with anchovies, or a little bit of anchovies or something like that. And then dinner, what I told you earlier, that's my very typical dinner. 50 grams of pasta or rice or whatever, and then 300 grams of legumes, and then 150 grams of vegetables. And actually, this allows me to eat more. So people always think I preach eating less. I never have. Eat more, because these are big dishes, and they serve many purposes and nourishment, and also sending the brain the signal that your stomach is full. I mean, don't overdo it, but I think eat enough.
Eat more, not just in terms of calories, but in terms of volume of foods and volume of the rice.
Not in terms of calorie, because what I just told you is actually very low calorie.
Yeah.
800 calories. It's a big dish with 800 calories. Yeah, you can have a much smaller dish that's got a ton of empty calories. And so, yeah, I'm against the Japanese saying of, always get up a little bit hungry. I think it's much better to always get up full of the right ingredients.
Beautiful. Well, for everyone listening, you've now heard the sample diet of one of the world's top longevity scientists. So, Dr. Longo, thank you so much. It's been an absolute honor and a privilege and so much fun to do this interview with you. And for everyone listening, go to Amazon and get a copy of this, the Longevity Diet. It's by far one of the best nutrition books I have read in a very, very long time, and lots of important information in this book to prevent disease and extend your lifespan. Dr. Longo, is there anywhere else you'd like to direct people to, your website or Prolon or anything like that?
Yeah, so Prof. Valter Longo, P-R-O-F, Valter Longo Facebook page. That's where we update people on the research, and also on new studies that are coming out. And also createcures.org is the foundation that I started that is doing a lot of, is sponsoring a lot of these studies. So createcures.org.
And can people go there and make donations? Is it like a charity or?
Yeah, it's a foundation, it's a charity, it's a nonprofit, and people can make donations.
Wonderful. Dr. Longo, thank you so much. It's been an honor, and have a wonderful day.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot, Ari.